Hello, everybody. I'm here today with Damien Walter, and recently I made a video talking about metamodernism. I kind of was attempting to lay out what metamodernism is, at least in film. And Damien made a video kind of responding to this with a little bit of maybe a critique. He had somewhat of a challenge, I think, to part of some of the claims that I was making in the video in a way that I thought was really thoughtful. We'll get into that, but first, before we do, for the people who are watching who maybe aren't familiar with what you do, can you give us a real quick rundown of kind of your background and maybe tie that into then like what your interest is in film and then metamodernism, if that's not too much of a bite to bite off it all at
I,
once.
I think I can do that. Yeah, so my name's Damien Walter. I'm probably still best known for like 7 or 8 years. I wrote for The Guardian, a kind of regular column about science fiction across all forms of storytelling, a lot of book storytelling. I'm still very much I'm a big sci-fi fan and I'm a sci-fi critic, which is sometimes like an internal contradiction because I love things and then I also have to take them apart. And I have a big science fiction community on Facebook. We just passed 26,000 members. So people want to talk more about sci-fi, they can come and do that. My YouTube channel is science fiction, and I do critiques of science fiction storytelling on there. I'm also, I'd say now, an independent researcher after being an academic for some years into story. So I spent about 10 years researching kind of all of the writing about storytelling, everything from Aristotle to Stephen King. And from that, I produced a course, which has been pretty successful online called The Rhetoric of Story, which is like 5 condensed hours of all my learning on storytelling. And then that moved me into a second course, which is called Writing the 21st Century Myth, which is about sci-fi and fantasy storytelling. And that brought me into thinking a lot again about myth and mythos and how our myths are formed. And that brought me to thinking about this kind of progression, which seems to happen in our stories and across our culture of starting with like the pre-modern and then modernist culture and postmodernist culture and then metamodernism. And so I've been involved with some online communities and discussions about metamodernism in its various forms. And it's a formative word. And there isn't, that's when it's most interesting. There isn't
Yes.
really any agreement yet about what metamodernism is. So if we have a dialogue, we might form part of what it is.
Yeah. And that's what I want to have. We'll kind of maybe start with your response to my video, talk a little bit about metamodernism, and then go from there. But spoiler alert, I also am very intrigued by Damien's kind of some of his thinking surrounding science fiction. So I have a few questions about that, and we this is starting at metamodernism, but we may stray far from that path. So we'll see where this dialogue takes us.
Okay.
I think it'll be interesting either way. Let's start with maybe I will kind of restate what I think your main critique was, and then you can correct me if there's anything like incorrect with that or anything you want to add to that, and then maybe we can just see where it goes from there. So it seemed like the central kind of objection you had to how I was laying out metamodernism in that video was me sort of overlooking or maybe misinterpreting, you felt, Top Gun Maverick as I'm seeing it as a modernist piece kind of is happening now in our metamodern era, and you sort of feel in fact that it is a metamodern film.
Mm.
So there's something critical that I'm overlooking there, maybe in how I'm thinking about metamodernism or how I'm thinking about Top Gun, that's causing me to overlook the fact that it is a metamodern work. Do you think that's an accurate representation?
I think so, yeah.
Okay,
From your video and my response to it, I
sure.
think that's a pretty good segue into it.
Yes. So my response to that was sort of like there's multiple levels on which we can look at the how we're evaluating a film. One is philosophical, one is contextual, and one is sort of like structural or stylistic. Um,
Mhm.
so I think structurally and stylistically, I would still firmly argue like I think that's where Top Gun Maverick still feels very modernist to me, where it really fits into this kind of conventional storytelling. Um, and then philosophically, that's where it starts to get a little more gray, I think. I would still
Mhm.
maybe it feels kind of still pretty modernist to me.
Mm.
That's where I would have a hard time pinpointing. I think a key element of metamodernism to me would be a movement or a relationship between postmodernism and modernism. And I would have a
Mm.
hard time identifying what about Maverick is necessarily postmodern,
Mm.
that is interacting with sort of the modernist spirit of it. Um, but then there's a third level, which is kind of contextual. And this is the one I think I would just go ahead and concede probably is metamodern.
Mm.
And that's sort of like the way in which people are interacting with it, kind of contextually surrounding the text. Another thing that I thought of, and I think even a commenter of mine pointed out about it, was that when you watch Top Gun Maverick in theaters, before the movie even started, there was a little introduction from Tom Cruise where Tom Cruise comes on the screen and he says, "Thank you so much for coming to the theater. You know, it's great that you're out here. We're making stories, blah, blah, blah." I forget exactly what he said, but he introduces the movie and kind of thanks the audience for being there and sort of talks about how important being at the theater is. And that strikes me, if you take that as part of the story, that strikes me as like a metamodern
Mm.
contextualization of the story. How are you looking at Top Gun Maverick philosophically and what it's doing? Um,
Mm.
am I missing something there by kind of thinking about it just as a modernist work?
Yeah, I think it's philosophical and contextual. I might also argue some of the stylistic elements because on and structural a little bit because yeah, it is stylistically and structurally modern, also with a pre-modern mythic
Sure.
part. So we've come back to Top Gun Maverick, and now he's not a character in a 1980s movie. He's this 40-year-old icon of like the trickster archetype in storytelling.
Right.
So he can survive any accident that happens to him. So we have that mythic side, very much like the modernist structure. But what I find with that film, so that was really popular with about half of my community
Right.
when we were chatting. And the thing they would say about it is not just that they liked Top Gun Maverick, but they were glad that this story was back
Yes.
with them. They want this story in their lives again. And that's the thing to me that definitely progresses into the philosophical metamodernism. Um, because I guess what I was pointing to in my response video is those of us who are kind of postmodern in our thinking and our cultural preferences can appreciate the parts of metamodernism that give us this increased level of postmodernism, the hypermodernism, the hyperreality. That's what I was going for in the stylistic level as well, that there is something truly hyperreal about Top Gun Maverick, that we know this environment doesn't exist. We know the bar in the Mojave Desert is a complete fantasy, but we're happy to accept it on some level, also as a realistic depiction for those people who want to. Um, and what Maverick is doing is giving us back this the modernist story that we can enjoy for the people who aren't postmodern in their thinking.
Right.
That if we on cultural level, of course, we can see that uh, these forms of storytelling really clash with each other. The people who want the modernist story back aren't happy with postmodern storytelling. A lot of my sci-fi community really hate Everything Everywhere All at Once, but they hate it in almost a kind of performative way. It triggers all these things about being postmodern or metamodernism, and they don't want that back. So these tiers are in conflict with each other. Um, and metamodernism for me is a step to saying we need some integration
Mhm.
between these. We want these different kinds of stories perhaps to work together. We also want them to be able to exist separately. And that means that a large part of what metamodernism will be for me will be really disliked by us more postmodern people. It will be this resurgence of modernist storytelling forms, pre-modern storytelling forms, and all of them coexisting and interoperating together in new ways with each other. So I guess a sign of the meta modern for me is that I will have this instinctual dislike of what a lot of metamodernism
Right.
is. It won't displease me. How do you feel about that, Thomas?
No, that resonates with me because um I think, kind of what you're laying out is the part of Top Gun Maverick that clashes a little bit with my sensibility is in fact that sort of the re-engagement with sincerity that is maybe sort of like I have the my more postmodern sensibility, I think, has kind of a reaction to a little bit.
Mm,
Um, Let me kind of throw this out there because I think it like as you were talking about this, it was kind of making me really think about the movie and like, is it
mm,
reconsider how I was looking at it. And one of the things I was thinking about was the role of nostalgia in this
mm,
dynamic, because it strikes me that framing this kind of story with such a clearly nostalgic lens does have kind of it positions it inherently sort of as something that comes after the thing itself. Like, so that's almost the most postmodern element of it. So it's very sincere. It is a return to that, but it's it knows it is a return to that. It knows it's a return
mm,
to something. There's this sense in the movie that like what the values that the film is putting forward are sort of like bygone in a sense. Um,
sure.
and so I think like that's one of the ways in which I can understand sort of its optimism and its sincerity in a little bit of a quote unquote postmodern sense because it's kind of acknowledging this is either fading or something's changing. This is not like
Mm,
what we're promote I, but it is still sincerely engaging with that. Maybe it's hoping
yeah.
to get back to that, even as it acknowledges that maybe that is kind of slipping away. And maybe
Mm,
that's where you could find this sort of like push and pull that I feel like is inherent to the metamodernism in a sense. Um, I don't know if you have thoughts about that. That's just how I'm kind of thinking about it as
yeah.
you're saying what you're saying.
Yeah. Definitely. I think one aspect of metamodernism is inescapable because of the structure of our media today. So we're now a hyper saturated media environment. So when I was a kid, it was the era of the video shop. So you go to the video shop, the early ones, and they had some VHS cassettes, and there was like 50 things that people had seen, which still felt like a lot at the time. And now, of course, everyone is in this hypersaturated media environment where there are hundreds of thousands of hours of YouTube being produced. You can be a YouTuber with 2 million followers, and nobody knows who you are when you meet them anyway, because everyone's in their own little
Yes.
bubbles. So for the thing that Tom Cruise is good at, I think now, is being at the top of this pyramid of people who basically have like no shared cultural memory because there's too much stuff. So Top Gun Maverick has to be packaged with all of its memories at the same time because you can't assume that people are coming uh even they remember what Top Gun was. They know there was a film, but you have to remind them what all the values are
Right.
associated with it. So Tom Cruise has to package this all together into a kind of cultural pill for people to swallow all in one go. And then they'll get the real payoff at the end of the movie. And then they go away back to the hypersaturated media environment and won't remember that Top Gun Maverick existed until 8 years from now. Tom reappears at 67 and does some kind of third part. Although I suspect Tom won't. And Tom Cruise is a fascinating person in and of himself. as like the last of the truly famous people. There was Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Tom Cruise. And Tom Cruise is the last one still on that
Yeah.
pedestal up there, I think.
You just described this shift in the media landscape that has happened. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about because I love McLuhan. I love, this idea of trying to understand the sort of implicit message of how we receive story and, not just the content. And I think there's so much change that has happened over the last like
Mm,
15, 20 years that still has not really been, um, you know we're still just attempting to understand what the messages of those changes are, or what the implications of those changes are. But I guess the question I have for you is, what do you personally see through sort of the lens that you have towards story and myth? What do you see as
mm,
some of the fallout of this hypersaturation? um, and what does kind of a path forward in that environment look
mm.
like for storytellers or for myth? Maybe that's too broad of a question, but
No, I totally understand it. I've been reviewing some of the like the definitional postmodern thinkers. So Baudrillard among them, who's really difficult to read,
yes,
incidentally.
he is.
Uh,
Yeah, I think I
so,
think I have a little bit of a grasp on what he's trying to get at, which might be the height of some kind of hubris. I don't know, but
well,
uh,
I go to good secondary sources and
right,
then go
yes,
back to the text and like,
yeah,
oh, okay, this little bit I get now.
yeah,
Um, but so he was like thinking in the 90s, basically 80s and 90s, and you have this kind of progression from McLuhan in the 50s and 60s on into the 90s, and they're trying to kind of look at what's coming and it's emerging. And by the 90s, it's very much there, and we got the proto internet emerging. Um, but we haven't hit the real hypersaturation, but it's already feeling crazy at that time. Um, and that's because people are really exposed to the whole of it. So you're still getting the whole of culture. You have only like some set of channels on your television. But what people have done in response to that craziness is we've all just tended to withdraw into some kind of manageable portion of the pie that is the media we're exposed to. So I guess I cling to it like a life raft, the science fiction label that I use, because it draws some kind of definable ring around what I'm going to talk about and who I'm talking to. But even within that ring, you can find groups of people who just don't agree on what science fiction is, particularly younger people who have a completely different definition and experience. Their map of science fiction is some set of video games that they've played, which I only barely know exist. And my older part of my community who are in their 70s and 80s and no comprehension that this stuff is even out there. And for younger people, they treat science fiction like me. I'm 45, so I'm somewhere in the middle, as more of a broad label of things. Um, so what we've all retreated into these little bubbles, and we can't quite agree on what they are. And those bubbles then have people like myself, and I guess like yourself as well, who are kind of shaping these little nice bubbles for people. So it might be a bubble of postmodern film or of 1950s science fiction or whatever it is. But when those intersect with each other, we have like our I guess our culture war arguments at that point emerge in the culture, and you have a similar thing going on, of course, in our politics and society. So the little silos that we're in are a really important aspect, and then we start myth making back into those silos. So to connect back to Tom Cruise for a second, he's like one of the last people trying to talk across a really significant
yeah,
bridge of siloed culture, which is probably the struggle for the cinema at the moment. Because what can you put in the cinema that cuts across the siloed culture? Well, it's really only these massive CGI spectacles where you don't even really need to understand the story. Essentially, you can just watch. They're really popular in foreign languages. I live in Bali. People go and watch the big CGI movies in English, even if their English isn't very good, because they're just going to watch
Yeah.
the bangs and whistles on
Right.
top.
One of the ways that complicates things is we get separated from this ability to like try to analysis of what the myths that are sort of driving people, it seems like becomes a
Mm,
lot harder in that kind of environment, because even figuring out what those little, like, I have a sense of which bubble that I'm in or which
mhm,
bubbles I'm in, but uh unless you're inside of one of those bubbles, they're actually sometimes very hard to find. Um,
mm,
like there's no directory of internet subcultures or um, special interest groups where you can look it up and then figure out how to go join that and get a primer on what's the knowledge you need to know to be a part of this
mm,
one. They're all just kind of emerging out of the sort of like algorithmic soup, that we're all swimming in.
mhm,
Um, and then, uh, yeah, so even trying to identify what, you're talking about myth forming within that, then I'm thinking
mm,
like, trying to understand those myths or find the commonalities between them or do some kind of
mm,
analysis of them at large seems like it becomes very challenging in that environment. But maybe that's not needed.
mm.
Do we need to? Maybe we don't need to analyze all the myths.
Uh, yeah, it depends on these conflict points, basically. So
Right,
I've been
right.
very, very drawn for um at least the last 4 or 5 years, I think. Um, Not to get too political, but for me, since the kind of the Trump Brexit year, which really changed how I thought about a lot of things politically, because I realized I was sitting in this bubble.
Yeah.
But it was a bubble that I shared with people who really didn't understand that there was anything outside our bubble, and that seemed quite dangerous to me. And that brought me back to thinking I'd encountered, like, in my, I guess 15, 20 years ago now, which is about this progression through modernism and postmodernism, and now what is being called metamodernism. Because if you want to try and navigate through these silos, we need some kind of pattern that
Right.
they're all in some way conforming to. And that progression with the pre-modern as well, that I see repeating over and over again. And it's an interesting map that these little siloed online communities, or they're not very little, they can have hundreds of millions of people form in. And usually the people who are shaping these bubbles, we have a really good understanding of kind of what set of values our bubble crosses, that it might be. So I know the kind of online Christian community quite well. That I've been getting to know it. And
Hmm.
this really values like pre-modern mythic structures with some touch into modernity as well. And whilst they're all very specific, the symbolism of the stories is very specific. The structures that they're working with, the mythic structures, are much more universal.
Right.
Um, but there's people in there who really see that. And then there's people in there where if you talk about the Christian mythos as a mythos, that's
Right.
really offensive to them, because
Yeah.
it's not just a made up story for them. But there's a few in there who are able to have the larger conversation as well. I don't know if that makes sense to you, Thomas.
No, no, that does make sense. I think
Mm,
to some extent, it sounds like you're saying there's kind of shapes and maybe archetypes would be the wrong word, but there's patterns and shapes here
mm,
to how these myths form. That if we can understand some of those, that's applicable to understanding kind of how myth is being formed and shaped, regardless of
mm.
sort of the bubble or the silo that
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
they're being formed in. Um, and that would make a lot of sense. I think, uh, those myth and story are so deeply rooted in us. Now that I'm saying it, I'm realizing, like having a small online group that's kind of determined around interest, ultimately, how different is that from, in some ways, from like the isolation of um, smaller countries, or that we would have had in groups
Yeah.
in the pre-modern world, or even the earlier modern world, and we can look back and see patterns in and similarities in how myths have developed throughout time from different isolated groups that had no connection to each other.
Mm.
So I guess it would make sense that those same things would arise even in these isolated online silos that we're
Yeah.
seeing now.
Yeah. Well, you have McLuhan's one of his famous phrases, the global village.
Yes. Yeah.
And he thought this would emerge from the media, but actually, what we see is a much more complicated picture of a global tribalism. We
Right.
we're much more
Yeah.
attracted to our online tribe than any group of people we physically interact with because we have a much better value
Yeah.
fit with them. Uh, and we can hope that we progress through, but we're very much in a tribal
Yeah.
phase at the moment. So, kind of being a successful YouTuber or having a big Patreon or whatever these new things are, which didn't exist some time ago. And I saw this transition happen like in the science fiction community. In the big awards for that, we went from the best book of the year winning the award to whoever the most popular blogger was or the person with the most Twitter activity, because the tribal identity is much more important to people than
Right.
the media people are absorbing. The media is just kind of symbolic of whichever tribe you feel comfortable in and have some status in as well.
Media as a
Yeah,
signifier
sure.
of your tribe, I think is a way that I haven't really thought about it, but that is really unlocking some things, getting the wheels turning. I'm gonna have to think about that one.
Sure. I mean, yeah, there's a lot in there, and we still have these. So I guess ironically, the, the kind of the more postmodern film tradition that you're clearly
Right.
very expert in kind of predates the tribalism, whilst
Yes.
it being
Yes.
very progressive. So it's one of these structures, a bit like science fiction as well. It predates the tribalism, so I can bring some people
Yeah.
together around it. But then we there are the new tribes which are post that, and they may touch on it. So I definitely have this in my community. There's an intersection of at least 7 or 8 online tribes who kind of feel some ownership for whatever science fiction is, and I have to try and bridge between them
Yeah.
to actually form a healthy community.
So something I want to get into a little bit is, we've kind of been talking about, there's pre-modern sort of myth, there's modernism, there's a postmodern reaction to that, and then there's metamodernism, which is maybe this attempt to return to something, or to kind of hold multiple things together in a balance, or is this kind of negotiation of postmodernism and modernism and traditional things at the same time.
Mm.
um, but one of the things that your work is kind of involved in that I find really interesting is kind of starting to chart out what some of these like new myths might be, that, or you're even calling them religions, I think, um, that are
Mm.
emerging out of science fiction, especially is your area of focus. And I wanted to discuss this a little bit because this is something I've been thinking about a lot, even before I encountered your work. Um, I, there, there's that Joseph Campbell phrase about no more grand narratives, or I'm probably butchering it, but there's some kind of, Joseph Campbell at one point said, made this very postmodern statement of, we've kind of like, there are no more unifying narratives that like people are holding on to as to charge into the future with. um,
Hmm.
and there's a truth to that, but then I also think that we do actually now see some new kind of myth. Like when I look at a figure like Elon Musk, um, I very much see somebody who is driven by like a set of beliefs about what is going to happen in the future
Hmm.
that cannot be grounded in any kind of real uh like scientific understanding of the future. It's like there
Hmm.
may be part of that, and his understanding of science is to a certain extent grounding what he thinks is going to happen in the future. But there's something more than that there. There's this kind of mythological like sense of like movement towards something. Um,
Mm.
and science fiction are like our sci-fi stories. The movies are the ones that I'm most familiar with, but sci-fi are the stories that are kind of like like exploring those that
Mm.
territory in the
Yeah.
most vivid way. Maybe you can give a brief introduction to how you're thinking about science fiction
Yeah.
and these kind of new myths or
Yeah.
religions that are emerging out of that.
Yeah. Well, that idea from Joseph Campbell comes from, so he wrote this epic 4-volume history of myth, Eastern and Western myth, prehistoric myth. And then the fourth volume is creative mythology, uh, that humans already, when he's writing, have a need to reinvent a kind of new mythology for the modern world. And interestingly, he doesn't look very much at science fiction because it was still more emergent what this mythology was. But his final endpoint for that is that we're all going to be myth making creatures, which we've just been talking about in
Right.
our kind of
Yes.
online tribalism there. Um, what happens with science fiction? I guess this is a bit of a history thread. Is that you have the Enlightenment turn historically. We've been Western Europe, kind of like a largely Christian society. So you look out to space, you see the heavens, potentially with like crystal spheres out there. And it's not necessarily that people believed that. There was a lot of understanding that it was metaphorical, but it just answers certain existential questions for you. What's out there? What will happen to me after I die? This kind of thing. And then we get rid of all of that. Science takes it all apart. This myth you've been told, science is very explicit. We're replacing it with a scientific view of the universe, Newtonian gravity, Einsteinian relativity, and we slot all of the parts of that in together. But human beings need a story to comprehend this. So you have this history of storytelling. So you could look at Voltaire, his book. It's not really a book, a text, Micromegas, which is this giant creature traveling across the galaxy. This is the 1750s. He's writing, and he's just familiar with Newtonian gravitation. So he starts describing how the planets would kind of interact with each other gravitationally. Uh, Skip forward, you can go to something like Star Maker, which is around the 1930s, and that's looking at the information coming in from radio astronomy, like the discoveries of Edwin Hubble, that there's this infinite number of galaxies out there, and it starts to describe what that is like. And then you get into like Star Trek. I think Star Trek is probably has defined what the universe is like for more people than anything else. And it makes it look a bit like 19th century Earth.
Mhm.
There's some other civilizations out there. We can go and trade with them on things that are a bit like naval starships. And it's all tied up with the space program and Apollo and going to the moon. And especially for people of that generation, um, it really solidifies into this is what the universe is. And that's what we're going to accept it as. Uh, to the point where if I say to a lot of people, well, maybe that's not what the universe is, they're going to look at me
Right.
funnily,
Yeah.
like a kind of heretic. No,
Yeah.
not even a heretic. Like, I must be mad. Okay.
Yeah.
But we know a lot about, so this really pivots on the idea of interstellar travel. So what we know scientifically, um, so Kim Stanley Robinson, in an interview that I participated with, basically said interstellar travel is impossible. It's a religious myth. We've made it up. We'll never be able to do it. And he wrote a novel called Aurora, which is an exploration of its impossibility, basically. Um, but that's very difficult for Elon Musk and all of his followers because their vision of the future is built on the idea that we will at least at some point be
Yeah.
able to do that. So I call that the interstellar mythos of the future, and it's even slightly religious in its structure because you can draw on it in that way. So Elon can say, he doesn't say, "I'm building low orbit delivery vehicles," because nobody
Right.
cares. He taps into the myth and says,
Yeah.
"We're going to Mars as our first step to immortality." And he knows, he's very smart. He knows how to draw the myth in
Yeah.
for his marketing. And he's done that with Neuralink. He's done that with his whatever his robot company will be.
Yeah.
Tesla draws on it a little bit as well. And I'd say that that mythos is very emergent from science fiction. And then you could look at others like transhumanism as well is a big emergent mythos in the world.
I think there's a very interesting there's a very interesting thing to some the dynamic of a myth like that, where it almost feels like we get to cast ourselves as like gods in the future, where like through
Hmm.
our progress we become these sort of gods. um and simulation theory I often think about in that way as well, where it's like, predicated on this idea that one day we may be able to simulate a universe like ours, so therefore we would assume that we are already in a simulation. And it's like, well, if you're imagining that sort of the people pulling the strings in our universe are essentially some like future version of ourselves, then that's a great way to just basically cast yourself as a figure, or like as a race that is essentially like the humans are just sort of on this path towards becoming gods inevitably if we,
Yeah.
like push this forward.
You see that you see that pattern across science fiction, and
Right.
it's very Nietzschean. Nietzsche's claims that we would get rid of God and we would make ourselves God
Yes.
instead.
Yeah.
So superheroes, especially like the Marvel mythos at the moment, is all the ways humans have become godlike, either by make your own metal suit or being an Asgardian. Um, but with something like Interstellar, what's really interesting, the reason I do a lot of research into the Christian mythos at the moment is that we end up just reinventing it in
Right.
popular science fiction stories. So Interstellar is Christian symbology. I went through in that analysis like 18 Christian symbols to the moment when Matthew McConaughey is talking to his earlier self by using gravitation waves. That's the Holy Trinity. Like, and people will doubt my analysis, but if you
Right.
watch the
Sure.
video, you'll be like, "Oh no, I see it." And I think Jonathan Nolan, to write things, I've kind of charted this for a few of his things. I think he'll just pick up a mythic structure and put
Yeah.
it in the story and attach modern symbols to it.
I think I think that's almost inescapable for any like uh writer who is really tapped, the like my sense is that a lot of these myths are so embedded in us that it can be like
Hmm.
really hard to escape that, um
Yeah.
when we go into creating things. Do you see these new myths that are emerging? Are you cynical about this, or do you see it as, um like in your wanting to understand and break these down and kind of help people understand these, or kind of begin to chart them and label them,
Mm.
do you kind of see yourself as a neutral passive anthropologist of these myths, um or do you have concerns about kind of things that you see arising in them?
Mm. Well, if you'd spoken to me maybe like 10, 15 years ago, I was an interstellar and a transhumanist in my cultural assumptions. So I try to be aware that I come very much from a like a modernist background. There's a joke in the science fiction community who often one of the things that the people who've been in that for a long time can observe is the way that things they invented in stories um, become not real, but people start speculating on them as a real
Right.
future. I
Yeah.
guess that viral tweet of science fiction of I invented the torment nexus as a warning to humanity.
Right.
A Silicon Valley tech startup, we have invented the torment nexus. Like that's the kind of pattern that you see.
Yeah.
So you have like the singularity and Ray Kurzweil. This is a big thing. A lot of Silicon Valley thinking is about the assumption of the singularity,
Yeah.
and in science fiction land, it's called the rapture of the nerds. It's it's our
Right.
equivalent of
Yeah.
being taken up to heaven by God.
Yeah.
So I was very much embedded in that, and I've tried to set myself out. I wouldn't make any claim to absolute objectivity, but increasingly I do just see a landscape of myths, be they religious myths, modern mythic narratives that we've put together. And that's what's kind of, I guess, forced me into seeking out like metamodern and other equivalent communities, especially in the philosophical arena. Anything that can bridge all of this and make sense of it is
Yeah.
very engaging to me.
This is it. This is all very fascinating to me. I love yeah, there's a lot of my interests here beyond film kind of intersect around
Mm.
some of these things. So um I don't want
Well,
to.
there's definitely other people you should speak to in the metamodern community.
Oh,
I think like
y-
maybe like Daniel Gortz, Hansi
okay.
Freinacht.
I'll have to.
He Daniel's a social scientist, and he wrote I think it's 3 volumes now of Nordic ideology, Nordic philosophy, as a fake philosopher called Hansi Freinacht, who has a big grey beard, and is the kind of philosopher who would produce this philosophy,
Right.
whereas Daniel might actually be skeptical of it. And he's probably got the most worked out model for this kind of developmental progression through the modern, the
Yeah.
postmodern, the metamodernism. Yeah.
Well, I don't want to keep you for too long. Where can people read more or listen to more of
Mm.
kind of your dissection of these things, or how could
But
I find more if I'm interested?
yeah. The science fiction podcast has been my main project. So you can find that on damiengwalter.com, or just search science fiction. I think it's usually at the top of searches on whatever podcast app you're in. And it's orange. It's an orange logo. So you see orange science fiction. And I've got at least 40, 50 episodes that are different angles on mythic storytelling today, basically. Um, Looking at like Star Wars Andor, and that had some really powerful Marxist symbolism in, which really surprised me coming from a Disney
Yeah.
production,
Yeah.
or anti-fascist or Marxist. There was some online discussion about that. And yeah, so the podcast is probably my main area, but I'm trying to reintegrate what I'm doing on the YouTube channel, because I tried to make YouTube videos that were kind of a wider discussion, maybe more populist, but I think actually the podcast content has ultimately been more successful. So my YouTube is going to be more like the podcast going forward.
Fantastic. Well, if you're listening, go check that out. And thank you so much, Damien, for taking the time to kind of talk about some of these things. It was fascinating. I think the problem with a conversation like this is there's so many places my mind like wants to take it simultaneously that it's hard to contain it down.
Yeah. I think
But
that's a real issue with metamodern thinking,
yes.
actually.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair enough. That might be maybe that's my problem. I'm just living too metamodern of a life, and I need to specialize a little bit more.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll help. But yeah, I appreciate this, and yeah, thanks so much.
Well, thanks for chatting with me.
Yeah.
It's always great to chat with people whose work you admire, and I really enjoy your channel.
Well, thanks for engaging with the video and taking the time to talk.